The tragedy of Janet Jackson is that she named the album that defined her entire career Control, but her whole life has been an endless battle to seize what that title promised. We remember the breathtaking choreography, the hit songs that tore apart every chart, and the woman who turned pop music into a declaration of power. What we don't see is the wound carried from the age of 10, the pain that no stage could heal. Over 100 million records sold, 7 #1 albums, 10 #1 songs on the Hot 100. The only black artist with an album at the top of the Billboard charts, spanning 4 decades. Her choreography shaped MTV. Her music broke racial and gender barriers. She is not Michael Jackson's little sister. She is an independent empire. And then, on February 1, 2004, everything she had built over 20 years was put on the scale. A piece of fabric was torn on live television in front of 143 million viewers. Within weeks, the woman who sold over 100 million records was erased from every radio station, banned on MTV, banned on VH1, banned from the Grammy Awards. Not because she lacked talent, but because a man tore her top on stage, and the entire system decided that she was the one who had to bear the consequences. Justin Timberlake, the man who directly tore her top, apologized on the Grammy stage, the ceremony where Janet was banned from entering. His career did not falter. 14 years later, he was invited back to the Super Bowl. She remained the band name. In the same incident, on the same stage, the white man walked away free. The black woman had her career burned. That was not an accident. That was the system. But this is what makes this story go beyond an ordinary tragedy. The woman who was stripped of everything did not disappear. At age 60, she stood on the Las Vegas stage, still selling out tickets, still making thousands of people stand up and cheer. The Together Again tour grossed over $106 million, the most successful of her 4-decade career, not at age 25, but at nearly 60 after it all. The question is not why she succeeded, but how. How does a person who was erased from the entertainment industry, tormented by depression, lost her brother, went through 3 broken marriages, gave birth to her first child at age 50, still step onto the stage and make the world remember that she has never stopped being a legend? The answer does not lie in talent. It lies in something deeper, and it can only be understood when we return to the 3-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana, where a 10-year-old girl was first told that her body was something that needed to be fixed. Before we look through the spotlight to find the woman who survived it all, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like for Janet Jackson. Janet Demita Jo Jackson was born on May 16, 1966, the youngest of 9 siblings. Her father, Joseph Jackson, was a welder and crane operator who sometimes worked 3 jobs at once to support the children in a working-class neighborhood. Her mother, Katherine Jackson, held the family together with faith and patience. Before Janet was born, her brothers had formed the Jackson 5 and become a global phenomenon under the Motown roof, moving the entire family from Gary to California. Janet grew up in the shadow of a family that had already become famous before she could even cry her first cry. Joseph Jackson was not the simple villain that the media often portrays. He was the man who used iron will to pull the family from the working class to the pinnacle of entertainment, and none of the Jackson children denied that. But the way he did it left wounds that even decades later had not healed. He forced his children to call him Joseph, never Dad, the kind of formal, cold, impersonal respect he demanded as an order, not a request. He used physical punishment and emotional control to push his children toward perfection. Many siblings, especially Michael, later spoke publicly about that abuse in front of millions of television viewers. Janet admitted that her brothers bore most of the beatings, and her father was easier on her and Randy. She reasoned that her parents were exhausted by the time they reached the 9th child, with no energy left to vent on the youngest ones. But easier did not mean warm. Janet shared that growing up, she never felt she experienced fatherly love the way she wanted, the way she saw in other children. She watched friends being hugged by their fathers, playing with their fathers, being called affectionate names by their fathers, and she did not have that. The distance between her and Joseph was not physical violence. It was emptiness, the absence of warmth where warmth should have existed. And for a child, emptiness is sometimes more painful than a beating, because a beating is at least presence, while emptiness is only nothingness. From the age of 7, Janet had stepped onto the stage with her brothers. Not because she wanted to, but because that was the path the Jackson family had laid out. And in this family, the path was not something to choose, but something to obey. She appeared on the television show The Jacksons, then landed roles in the series Good Times, Diff'rent Strokes, and Fame. Her career came to her before she could even ask herself if she really wanted it. But it was Good Times that carved the deepest wound. In 1977, at age 10, Janet was cast as Penny, a child who was abused and needed love. Before the camera started rolling, she received 2 instructions from the production team. First, she was too fat and needed to lose weight. Second, because she was starting to develop breasts, they made her bind her chest to look flat in front of the lens. She was only 10 years old. A 10-year-old child who had not yet understood how her body was changing was told that that change was wrong, needed to be hidden, needed to be compressed to fit the mold that adults had already decided. The message that little Janet received that day was clear and cruel. Your body is something that needs to be fixed, not something to be proud of. And that seed, sown into the soft soil of a child with no armor to protect herself, would sprout into a battle with body image that lasted for the next 4 decades. In the Jackson family, Janet was closest to Michael. They bonded over the shyness that the outside world never saw, over the love of animals that the 2 siblings shared as their own language, over the feeling of growing up under pressure that no child should have to endure. Michael was the one who understood her more than anyone else in the world. Same childhood, same father, same stage, same burden. But love and wounds in the Jackson family had never been separate. It was Michael himself, the brother she loved the most, who also called her names like pig, horse, slaughter pig, cow. He laughed when he said those words, and she laughed along, because that was how this family operated, turning pain into jokes so no one had to admit that it really hurt. But deep inside, those words took root in places that laughter could not reach, and they were never truly pulled out. This was the first lesson Janet learned, a lesson that would repeat throughout her life like a curse. Those closest to her were at the same time the ones who hurt her the most, and she had to learn to love them without letting the wounds swallow her whole. Many years later, when looking back on her childhood, Janet wrote that she wished someone had told that 10-year-old girl that she looked fine. She looked healthy. Being a little chubby was not the most important thing in life. Enjoy childhood. Don't look in the mirror and compare yourself to others. But no one said that. Not because no one loved her, but because in the Jackson family, love was expressed through expectations, through discipline, through relentless pushing toward perfection, never through a simple sentence that you are already good enough. And from that silence, a girl grew up with low self-esteem embedded deep in her bones, a persistent feeling of insecurity running beneath every achievement, and the belief that she had to constantly prove she deserved to exist on the stage that others had placed her on before she could choose. Everything that happened afterward, all of it, began from the 3-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana, and a little girl who was told that her body needed to be fixed before the world was allowed to see it. The first 2 albums in Janet Jackson's career were the clearest proof of what she would spend her whole life fighting against: the control of others. Her debut album, titled Janet Jackson, released in 1982 when she was only 16 years old, and the second album, Dream Street, came out 2 years later, both fully managed by Joseph Jackson. He chose the producers, he chose the songs, he decided the image, and Janet was just the voice placed into the mold her father had already cast. Both albums failed to make a significant impression on the charts, and the reason was not because Janet lacked talent, but because that talent had never been allowed to speak in its own way. She was still a product of Joseph Jackson, not of Janet Jackson. But after the second album, the girl who had been made to call her father Joseph did something that almost none of the Jackson children dared to do. She fired her father from managing her career. At age 19, in a family where the father's will was law, Janet chose her own path. She turned to 2 producers, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, a decision that at the time no one could know would change pop music history. This was the first and most important control action in her life, not on stage, not in the studio, but in her own family, where saying no to Joseph Jackson required a courage that no chart could measure. The third album was born in 1986, and she named it Control. The name was not random, it was a declaration. Every song on the album was an affirmation sung straight into the face of everything that had ever controlled her. I control my life. I control my body. I control my music. And I don't need permission from anyone to exist the way I choose. The album topped the Billboard 200, sold over 10 million copies worldwide, and produced 5 top 5 hits. The child who was told her body was wrong now had her own name, her own sound, her own image. She was 20 years old. But Control was not just commercial success, it created an entirely new sound for pop music, blending R&B, funk, and the first elements of New Jack Swing into something no one had heard before. The choreography in the music videos became the new standard for MTV, and more important than any numbers. A young black woman was declaring self-determination over her body and sexuality on mainstream television in the mid-'80s, an era when MTV was still dominated by white artists and black women were rarely given the microphone to say anything beyond safe love songs. 3 years later, she pushed the boundaries even further. If Control was a personal declaration, then Rhythm Nation 1814 was a social declaration. The fourth album released in 1989, and Janet did what pop music at the time avoided. She brought racism, poverty, violence, drugs into her music, not as slogans but as calls to action wrapped in sharp pop melodies and choreography precise to the millimeter. The album topped the Billboard 200 for 4 consecutive weeks, produced 7 consecutive top 5 hits, 4 of which reached number 1 in 3 different calendar years, a record that to this day has never been broken. Many years later, the Library of Congress inducted this album into the National Recording Registry, a list of recordings considered culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant to America. The choreography in the Rhythm Nation video became one of the most iconic choreographies in television music history, and it was not done by a white artist in the era of Madonna, but by a 23-year-old black woman from Gary, Indiana, who 4 years earlier was still singing songs chosen by her father. After the shocking success, it was Richard Branson himself, owner of Virgin Records, who personally approached Janet to sign a recording contract worth $32 to $50 million, one of the largest in music industry history at the time. That number was not just money. That was the industry officially bowing its head to admit that Janet Jackson was no longer Michael's sister. She was an independent empire, and that empire had its own value. The fifth album, Janet, released in 1993, debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 with 350,000 copies sold in the first week, setting the record for first-week sales by a female artist at that time. The song Again from the movie Poetic Justice, in which she starred, was nominated for both an Oscar and a Golden Globe for Best Original Song. The song That's the Way Love Goes won a Grammy. She was not only the queen of pop, she was simultaneously a film actress, a cultural icon, an artist that every record label in the world wanted to sign. By 1997, when most pop stars chose to repeat the successful formula, Janet went in the opposite direction. The album The Velvet Rope was the work in which she delved deepest into her inner self, addressing personal depression, domestic violence, LGBTQ rights, and sexual self-discovery, all in an era when pop music was still expected to be safe, superficial, and easily digestible. Janet put her pain on the table when no one asked her to, and critics responded with the highest reviews of her career, placing her in the position of an artist with depth rather than just an entertainer. Then All For You debuted in 2001, her 7th album, once again debuting at number 1, with the song Someone to Call My Lover becoming a global hit. By that point, Janet had sold over 100 million records, had 10 number 1 songs on the Hot 100, 16 number 1 songs on the R&B charts, 5 Grammy Awards, 11 American Music Awards, 11 Billboard Music Awards, and Billboard ranked her as Mariah Carey's closest rival for the title of the most successful female recording artist of the decade. By early 2004, Janet Jackson was standing at the highest position her career had ever reached, nearly 2 decades of uninterrupted dominance. She had reclaimed control from her father's hands, built an empire from nothing, broken every barrier the industry and society placed in front of her, and proved that a black woman from a 3-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana, could stand at the top of the world through her own talent and will. Super Bowl SXV3, February 1, 2004, At NRG Stadium in Houston, Texas, 143 million television viewers were watching the halftime show produced by MTV. Janet Jackson was the main star of the night. At the end of the program, Justin Timberlake appeared unexpectedly duet the song "Rock Your Body" with her. When the song ended, right as Timberlake sang the final line, he reached out and tore a part of Janet's Alexander McQueen outfit, exposing her right breast for 9/16 of a second before the television director cut to a wide shot of the stadium. Her breast was covered by a star-shaped shield, 9/16 of a second. Not long enough for the naked eye to clearly process what had just happened, but long enough to destroy everything this woman had built over 20 years. The chain reaction erupted at a speed that even the incident itself could not match. The Federal Communications Commission immediately opened an investigation. CBS panicked under pressure from advertisers and conservative audiences. The NFL severed ties with MTV and never allowed the channel to produce the halftime show again. The term wardrobe malfunction was born, a polite euphemism designed to avoid the real question no one wanted to answer directly. Who was responsible? The event became the most searched event in internet history at that time. Janet Jackson's name became the most searched name and image on the entire internet throughout 2004 and 2005. The world knew her name, but not because of 100 million records sold, not because of Billboard records no one had broken, but because of 9/16 of a second on live television. Then the bans began. This was not fate or bad luck. This was a deliberate action carried out by specific people with specific power. Les Moonves, CEO of CBS Corporation, oversaw the blacklisting of Janet Jackson across the entire Viacom media system. MTV, the very channel that Janet's choreography had helped turn into an empire, stopped airing her videos. VH1 stopped playing her music. Viacom-owned radio stations removed her songs from playlists. Music videos disappeared from the airwaves as if they had never existed. Just 1 week after the Super Bowl, she was banned from attending the Grammy Awards. Her newly signed film contract was mercilessly canceled. A symbolic Mickey Mouse statue wearing her iconic Rhythm Nation outfit was dismantled. Pieces of her legacy were systematically stripped from public space, as if 20 years of dominating the music industry could be erased by an administrative decision. And while all of that was happening to Janet, Justin Timberlake, the man whose hand had directly torn her top on stage, walked away almost unscathed. At first, he even joked about the incident on camera, telling Access Hollywood that he liked giving people something to talk about. Later, when public pressure increased, he apologized on the Grammy Awards stage, the ceremony where Janet herself was banned from setting foot. No radio station banned his music. No television channel removed his videos. No contracts were canceled. His career continued upward without faltering. And 14 years later, in 2018, he was invited back to perform on the Super Bowl stage itself, promising that the wardrobe malfunction will not happen again, while Janet Jackson's name remained the band name associated with the word scandal. Pointing out this contrast is not to turn Timberlake into the villain of the story, but to look straight at what that contrast reveals. The same incident, on the same stage, in the same moment, but the system treated the two people completely differently, and that difference could not be explained by any factor other than gender and race. Author Sarah Deatum, in her book Toxic: Women, Fame, and the Tabloid 2000s, pointed out that whether the incident was intentional or accidental, Janet had been spat out by the media, and the racism against her was extremely clear. After being blacklisted from radio from MTV and VH1, she found work in African American culture, starring in films for Tyler Perry. That showed the extent to which white America had rejected her, not because she lacked talent, but because the system decided she was no longer allowed to exist in the space she had helped build. The numbers that followed tell the rest. The album Demita Joe, released in 2004, right after the incident, was directly affected by the blacklist. Sales dropped sharply compared to all previous albums. The following albums, 20YO in 2006 and Discipline in 2008, continued to bear the consequences like unhealed burns. She left Virgin Records, signed with Island Records, then left again. Each new album was an uphill battle against the unofficial ban that she could not see with her eyes, but felt in every sales figure, every song not played, Every door closed in front of her without anyone bothering to explain why. Janet publicly apologized right after the incident. She said the plan was made after the final rehearsal and CBS, MTV, NFL were not notified in advance. But after that apology, she remained almost completely silent about the incident for many years. That silence was both the last armor she still controlled and the highest price she had to pay, because when she was silent, she let others write the story about her. The world called the incident by the names Nipplegate and Janetgate, and the name attached to the scandal was not Timberlake, but Jackson. The little girl who was made to bind her chest at age 10, the girl who named her album Control to declare self-determination, the woman who fired her father and built an empire through pure talent. That woman was once again stripped of control over her own life. This time not by her father, but by a man who tore her top on live television, and another man sitting in the CEO's office who decided to erase her career. And both of those men, after it all, walked away without a single scratch. What the world saw after the Super Bowl was declining album sales, a name disappearing from the airwaves, a career cut short at its peak. But what the world did not see was the battle taking place behind closed doors, where no cameras recorded and no charts measured. In 2018, in an open letter published in Essence magazine, Janet first told the world about the battle she had fought in silence for many years: depression. She wrote that her 30s were the most difficult period, that the battle with depression was very intense, that low self-esteem could stem from childhood insecurity, could be related to never meeting the high standards she set for herself, or that were placed on her shoulders. And of course, there were always social issues of racism and sexism, weighing on top of everything. Putting it all together, depression became a persistent and terrifying condition. Those lines sounded like the confession of someone who had just escaped a decades-long war. But the truth is, depression never really ends. It only changes shape, and for Janet, one of its most persistent forms was food. She admitted she was an emotional eater. When stressed, when sad, when feeling out of control, food brought comfort that nothing else could replace. Her weight fluctuated continuously over the years, and every gain or loss became tabloid headlines, as if her body was public property that anyone had the right to comment on. In 2005, when she gained weight, her nutritionist warned that she was approaching diabetes. Even when she lost weight and gained it back, the fear of heart disease always lurked like a shadow that never left. In her 2011 memoir, True You, she wrote that for over 30 years, she had struggled with yo-yo dieting, and even at her thinnest, when her body was praised by the public, she was not happy with the image in the mirror or her sense of self. The book topped the New York Times bestseller list, and in it she described herself with a honesty that few stars dared to touch. Very emotional, very vulnerable, extremely sensitive, with lifelong behavior patterns that caused difficulties that she knew needed to be broken, but could not always do. The little girl who was told her body needed fixing at age 10 was now a grown woman. But the battle with the mirror had not ended. It had only moved from the Good Times film set to tabloid covers, and then to nutrition clinics, changing the setting but not the essence. While trying to rebuild her career after the Super Bowl disaster, her body betrayed her once again. In 2008, Janet was forced to cancel multiple consecutive shows on her tour. After many tests, doctors confirmed she had vestibular migraine, a rare form of migraine accompanied by severe dizziness, making her feel like the room was spinning around her. For anyone, this condition was debilitating enough. But for a performer who lived on choreography, a person for whom every show demanded body precision down to every step, the balance-losing condition was a blow to the very weapon she used to fight the world. Then on June 25, 2009, the heaviest blow came. Michael Jackson, the brother closest to her, the one who shared the shyness, the love of animals, and the burden of childhood under Joseph Jackson's roof, the one who understood her more than anyone else in the world, but was also the one who once called her pig and cow, and laughed as if the pain did not exist. That brother passed away from cardiac arrest due to propofol anesthesia injected by his personal doctor. Janet blamed Dr. Conrad Murray. She confirmed that the family had tried many times to intervene to get Michael into rehab but failed because Michael lived in denial and would not accept that he needed to be saved. Losing Michael was not just losing a brother. It was losing the only person on this earth who shared the exact experience of growing up in the Jackson family, from the same perspective, with the same wounds, with the same laughter hiding the pain. And with Michael's departure, Janet was left with a double pain that nothing could resolve. She missed the brother she loved, while forever losing the opportunity to heal the wounds he had unintentionally carved into her when both were children who did not know that words could leave scars. After Michael's death, the Jackson family sank into chaos. Estate disputes erupted. The trial of Conrad Murray dragged on and was relentlessly chased by the media. All eyes turned to the Jackson family with the cruel curiosity of entertainment media. And Janet, though the youngest, though the one who had always been protected by her siblings her whole life, quietly became the emotional pillar for the entire family. The image of her hugging her niece, Paris Jackson, the 11-year-old child who had just lost her father, at Michael's memorial at Staples Center, in front of millions of television viewers, became one of the most touching images of that year, and also the image that said the most about who Janet was, the person who always bore things in silence so that others could cry out loud. Looking back at the entire journey from the 3-bedroom house in Gary to this point, a red thread running through it all becomes painfully clear. A controlled childhood sowed the seeds for low self-esteem. Low self-esteem opened the door to depression. Depression pushed her into the cycle of emotional eating. A changing body became fodder for tabloid judgment. The Super Bowl destroyed the career she had used her entire youth to build. Her body betrayed her with vestibular migraine. Then Michael left and took with him the shared memories that no one else on earth could replace. Each pain did not stand alone. They piled on top of each other like layers of sediment, each new layer heavier than the last. And the foundation underneath had never been truly solid from the beginning. Throughout it all, Janet almost never spoke about these things in public. The silence protected her from media dissection, but it also isolated her within her own pain. A fortress that kept enemies outside but also locked the person inside. If Janet Jackson's career was the stage where she fought the world, then her personal life was the closed room where she fought her own desire to be loved. And she protected that room with a secrecy so intense it became legendary. 3 marriages, all 3 secret. Many romantic relationships were only confirmed years after they ended. She did not hide her private life out of arrogance. She hid it because she had learned very early that anything she exposed would be taken away, distorted, or used against her. Secrecy was not a personality trait. It was a survival instinct, the last armor she still controlled when everything else could be snatched from her hands at any moment. The first marriage came early and fell apart before she could even understand what it was. In 1984, at age 18, Janet eloped and married singer James DeBarge. The marriage was annulled just 1 year later, but the rumors dragged on for decades. People said she had secretly had a child, that the child was given to her sister to raise. It was not until 2022, in the documentary named after herself, that Janet directly denied it. She said she could never keep a child away from its father. That would be wrong. The rumor stemmed from her weight gain due to birth control pills while filming Fame. But the truth did not matter as much as the story the world wanted to tell, and the first marriage taught her the bitterest lesson. Even in love, she could not control the story others wrote about her. The second marriage was the clearest proof of the level at which she protected her private space. In 1991, Janet married René Elizondo Jr., a dancer and music video director who contributed greatly to her artistic image during her peak period. They lived together for nearly a decade without a single newspaper or paparazzi lens, knowing they were husband and wife. The public only found out when Elizondo filed for divorce in 2000. Hiding a marriage for 8 years under global spotlight required almost superhuman control, but it also spoke to a profound loneliness. When you hide a marriage for nearly a decade, you are not only protecting your privacy, you are hiding yourself because you believe the world will hurt your softest part if it is exposed. Between and after the marriages, Janet had notable relationships. Rapper Q-Tip, actor Matthew McConaughey, and especially producer Jermaine Dupri, a relationship that lasted about 7 years and was considered her most serious outside of marriage. All were only confirmed years after they ended, as if Janet's love was only allowed to exist in the light after it had died. Then the third marriage came, and with it the cruelest repetition of the central motif in her life. In 2010, Janet met Wissam Al-Mana, a Qatari billionaire businessman. They married secretly in 2012, but according to her brother Randy Jackson, the marriage quickly became a prison. Randy said that Janet had endured verbal abuse and a constant feeling of being controlled, that she lived like a prisoner in her own home, that the abuse occurred even throughout a difficult pregnancy. Not physical violence, but emotional and linguistic control, the kind of control that left no bruises on the skin but only bruises in the soul. The cruel paradox to the point it was almost unbelievable. The woman who had fired her father to seize self-determination, who had named her album Control to declare she belonged to no one, was once again being controlled. This time not by her father, not by the industry, but by the man she chose to love. But in the darkness of that marriage, a spark appeared. On January 3, 2017, Janet gave birth to her son Asa Al-Mana at age 50. And for the first time in her life, the emotion was completely positive. No buts attached, no price to pay. She wrote that the peak of happiness was holding her son in her arms and hearing him babble, when looking into his smiling eyes and seeing him respond to her gentleness, when kissing him, when singing him to sleep, that in those sacred moments, happiness was everywhere. But the darkness did not stay away for long. 3 months after giving birth, Janet and Wissam separated. The divorce became a bitter battle. The two sides were completely opposed on how to raise Asa. Janet wanted Western-style education. Wissam wanted his culture. Lawyers from both sides could not finalize the paperwork because they could not get the two to agree on anything. Janet was so worried that she called the police to check on her son's safety when Asa was with his father. The police confirmed the child was fine, but a mother's worry who had once been controlled was never soothed by a police report. Janet said her childhood forced her to change completely in her role as a mother. She did not want her son to grow up with the feelings she had carried her whole life. She left London, returned to the United States, and became a single mother co-raising Asa. She shared that being a mother was the most beautiful thing, and she loved every minute. Looking back at Janet's entire romantic journey, father controlling her childhood, the entertainment industry controlling her career, husband controlling her marriage, then Asa, the child born when she was 50, was the only thing that no one, no system, no man could snatch from her hands. For the first time in 6 decades, real control belonged to her. Not control of her career or image, but control of love. The only thing that no album, no million-dollar contract could give, and no one could take away. Janet Jackson's story could have ended after the Super Bowl. She could have disappeared like so many other artists, crushed and forgotten by the industry. But Janet did not disappear. She also did not beg anyone to reopen the door that had slammed shut in front of her. Instead, she built another door herself. In 2018, at the Billboard Music Awards, Janet Jackson stepped onto the stage to receive the Icon Award and performed a career retrospective set that brought the entire audience to their feet. That was not a comeback, because she had never really left. It was a reminder that this career could not be killed by a ban. And in her acceptance speech, she did not talk about herself. She spoke out in support of the Me Too movement, once again using the stage to talk about women's rights, just as she had done 32 years earlier with the album Control. 1 year later, in 2019, 15 years after being blacklisted, Janet was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. This was not forgiveness from the industry. It was the industry finally having to admit that greatness could not be erased by an administrative ban. Janet did not need the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to prove her worth. Over 100 million records sold had done that long ago. But the recognition showed that time, though slow, ultimately stood on the side of truth. Then in 2022, after decades of silence letting others tell her story, Janet did what she had never done. She told it herself. The 4-part documentary titled Janet Jackson aired on Lifetime and A&E, and for the first time, the world heard the story in her own voice, not the tabloid voice, not the media voice, not the voice of the men who had decided for her for decades. She talked about her father, about Michael, about her marriages, about the Super Bowl, about the 2004 incident. She said, of course, it was an accident, that it should not have happened, But people were looking for someone to blame, and that had to stop, that Justin and she were very close friends and always have been. The documentary was the final and most complete control action, reclaiming the right to tell her own story after letting others write it for 20 years. But the most convincing comeback was not in words, but in the numbers no one could argue with. In 2023, Janet launched the Together Again tour, and the tour grossed about $106 million in ticket revenue, becoming the most successful tour in her entire 4-decade career. Not at age 25 when she was dominating every chart, but at nearly 60 years old, after being blacklisted, after depression, after 3 divorces, after losing her brother. That number said more than any defense. The industry could blacklist her, but it could not blacklist the hearts of millions who grew up with her music. From December 2024 to September 2025, she performed 22 shows at Resorts World Theater in Las Vegas, still selling out tickets, still performing choreography, still drawing crowds at nearly 60 years old. She no longer needed MTV. She no longer needed radio stations. She had built a direct relationship with the audience without needing any intermediary. And in June 2026, at age 60, she had 4 nights of performances scheduled in Japan, Kobe, Yokohama, Nagoya. Previous shows in Japan had sold out. She was still creating new shows for new audiences on new stages. Perhaps the most beautiful proof of the vitality of Janet's legacy lies in a place she could not have predicted. In 2025, the hit Someone to Call My Lover, released in 2001, unexpectedly returned to the official dance singles chart in the UK, when a completely new generation of listeners discovered the song on TikTok and began buying and streaming it en masse. A 24-year-old song by an artist blacklisted 21 years earlier was dominating the charts thanks to Gen Z, people who had not even been born when the Super Bowl incident happened. And the album Rhythm Nation 1814, the album that MTV had once banned from airing, was now inducted by the Library of Congress into the National Recording Registry, the list of recordings preserved by the nation for their cultural, historical, or aesthetic significance. The banned album was now national heritage. Janet's legacy did not just live in museums or charts. It lived in the artists who came after her. Britney Spears, Beyoncé, Ciara, Tinashe, and many others publicly acknowledged Janet as the biggest influence on their performance style and music. Janet did not just open the door for the next generation, she broke down the wall. And those who walked through that wall knew exactly who had broken it. But honoring Janet by sugarcoating her story would be a betrayal of the very strength she represented. In 2024, in an interview with The Guardian, Janet repeated incorrect information about the race of presidential candidate Kamala Harris, saying Harris was not black. The statement caused a strong backlash. A person claiming to be her manager issued an apology, but was denied by Janet's representatives. The matter was messy and not pretty. Mentioning this is not to tear Janet down, but to see her exactly as a human being, with mistakes and blind spots that anyone can have. She was not a perfect icon, and it was that very imperfection that made her strength truly worthy of respect. The losses did not stop there either. Joseph Jackson passed away in 2018 at age 89. Despite the complicated relationship throughout life, Janet said she continued to love her father until the final moment. Tito Jackson, one of her brothers, passed away in 2024. The Jackson family continued to shrink each year, and Janet, the youngest sister, who had grown up in the shadow of the whole family, now had to face gradually becoming the last storyteller of a dynasty that was closing. Janet Jackson named her 3rd album Control. In 1986, that was the name of a collection of songs. But now, after having gone through her entire journey, from the 3-bedroom house in Gary to the peak of Billboard, from 9/16 of a second on live television to the dark room where depression would not let her sleep, from the hand of the man who tore her top to the tiny hand of her son holding her finger at age 50, the word control was no longer just the name of an album. It was the summary of a lifetime. Every stage in Janet's life was a battle to gain or lose control. Control of her body from the hands of the film crew that made her bind her chest at age 10. Control of her career from the hands of the father, who made her call him Joseph. Control of the story about herself from the hands of the media that named the scandal after her instead of the man who tore her top. Control of love from the hands of the husband who turned marriage into a prison. And at age 60, she was still fighting. Janet Jackson could not be neatly packaged into any easy template. She was not a passive victim waiting for the world to apologize. She was also not an undefeated warrior whose every blow bounced off her armor. She was a woman who had lived at both extremes of human experience, who had dominated the charts and been erased from the charts, who had broken barriers and been crushed by those very barriers, who had loved deeply and been hurt most severely by the very people she loved. She had made mistakes, had said wrong things, had been silent when she should have spoken up and spoken up when she should have been silent. Remembering only the victories would sugarcoat her story. Remembering only the pain would betray the strength she had to bleed to obtain. Janet's true legacy does not lie in 100 million records sold, does not lie in 5 Grammy Awards, or the plaque with her name in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It lies in every black girl who saw her on MTV in 1986 and for the first time believed she could claim the stage without asking anyone's permission. In every artist who dared to bring racism, poverty, gay rights into pop music because Janet had done it before it was considered acceptable. In every woman suppressed by the system, turned away by the industry, dissected by the media, but who refused to disappear. In every single mother at age 50 looking into her child's eyes and deciding that she would start over, that she would love this child in the way she had never been loved, that the cycle of trauma would stop in this generation. The final image is this: Janet Jackson, 60 years old, stepping onto the stage at Resorts World Theater in Las Vegas. Not the biggest stage in the world, not in front of 143 million television viewers, but she was there by her own choice, on her own terms, on her own stage. No one invited her back. No one gave her permission to stand there. No record label told her she was allowed to sing again. She decided for herself. And that after 60 years, after all the times of being stripped and all the times of reclaiming, was truly control. Throughout every peak and every abyss, every time she was pushed down and every time she stood up herself, one thing never changed. The music that Janet Jackson created made the world feel freer, stronger and closer to the truth about itself. The industry could blacklist her. The media could judge her. Time could change her. But nothing and no one could take that away. When looking back at Janet Jackson's journey, what is the first thing that comes to mind for you? Is it the choreography that changed the way the world saw the stage, the music that gave you courage you did not know you had, or the strength of the woman who refused to be extinguished? Share in the comments below and help us honor the woman who taught the world that the right to control your own life is not something given, but something that must be seized, day by day, one day at a time. If Janet Jackson's story touched you, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next stories about legends the world has not fully told. Thank you for staying until the very end. See you in the next video.